Welcome back to The Social. As you may have heard, a First Nation community in Kenora, Ontario has discovered 171 what they call anomalies on the grounds of a former residential school. Well, the First Nation announced these discoveries are plausible burials and that further steps must be taken to gain greater certainty into the number and also to investigate several additional sites. The discoveries are all part of an investigation that began back in May of 2022 following testimonials from school survivors and archaeological assessments. Ivory, we'll start with you. This is another sad and tragic revelation on yet the grounds of another former residential school. Sadly, we don't think it's going to be the last one by a long shot.
No.
So how do we keep having these news stories and have them, I think, stay fresh and have that impact that we hope it has on everybody who hears the story?
I think that, first of all, it's heartbreaking. Second of all, it's not surprising because Indigenous communities have been sounding this alarm for years. Before they actually started investigating, Indigenous communities were saying somewhere around 4,300 children were said to have died within residential schools in Canada. And that's what sort of launched this inquest. Now, I think the problem is that originally, Canadians at large, we went, this is terrible when the first 215 children were discovered. And then other news stories sort of took precedent, they took our focus away, and we forgot that this is still happening right now. And so our job
What do you mean by that?
We are still discovering more remains. We are still discovering more bodies. We are still centering Indigenous voices and Indigenous stories and trying to heal this trauma and find reconciliation. And what does reconciliation look like at this point when we are digging up dead babies? But it looks like centering Indigenous voices. It looks like holding space for survivors and for the loved ones, who are still here, also the loved ones who were killed. And it looks like holding our government accountable. So that means we need to look to the 94 calls to action, which was released and acknowledged in 2015. But to date, we've only seen our government complete 13 of those 94 calls, and we need to do better.
Yeah.
We need to do better.
With my daughter's generation, the only good news in all of this is that her generation is going to grow up very differently than perhaps ours did. For a lot of us, we just didn't know about this horrific part of our history, and as you say, continues to this day. And every time these news stories come up, I have to always stop and I pause and I talk to my daughter about it. She went and placed shoes, a pair of her older little shoes, at our local Catholic church when the first story happened and broke. And I wanted that to be a powerful moment for her because we're all being raised. She's not being raised Catholic, but I was raised Catholic. And it was a moment that I thought, okay, don't let this end here, Mom.
Yes.
Don't let this end here, Dad.
Yes.
And so the stories happen. And so I always, in my mind, think, let this next generation be better than ours.
Yes.
And let her never forget that this is part of our, not only our history, it's still happening today. And I think until every single First Nation and Indigenous community has the closure that they need, whatever that looks like.
And compensation.
And compensation.
Honestly, I'm sorry.
And compensation
we need
as
to
well.
hold the Catholic Church and the Canadian government accountable financially, because it seems to be that's one of the only ways that they'll really understand the impact that has been wrought by this genocide.
It's you mentioned the image of the shoes. So many schools participated across the country in that, and I hope continue to because it was very powerful. Every time driving by, people are nodding their heads. Like it just forced everyone to stop. But I think we need to go a lot further than that. Like when the Pope visited Canada last year, there was we saw a lot of these long red banners being held up with the names of kids who never returned home, and of course there are many more names that will be added to that as we discover more of these. But I think there needs to be a permanent place where we can go to. And Calgary is actually working on this right now as we speak. But I think this has to be across Canada, right? Because these happened across Canada. And there is something really powerful. You think about the Holocaust museums, and there are many around the world, Holocaust memorials and museums. This is the one in Berlin. And it allows people to go in and reflect and learn and actually, sort of have a penance, a moment of really acknowledgement. And people come to experience this. I think of the World Trade Center on 9/11, the memorial that was there. And it took input input from people, designers and people who I believe who had experienced loss, who, the water was very significant because it would, blur out the sound of the city, and also you could touch the names of the victims. And I think with Indigenous input, I think this is at least some gesture forward if we start to think about that.
I think the key is to how you galvanize the emotion that you feel going to a museum like that into the action steps,
That's right.
And to your point, you were talking about the 94 recommendations.
Yes.
And how only 13 have been put forward. You used the word reparations, you were the apology. And the thing is, the Indigenous communities have been asking for this for a long time.
Yes.
Unfortunately, they can't do it alone. They haven't been able to. So it's up to how do we get the moment where we put the shoes at the school and translate that into pressuring our government, pressuring our leaders into making that change. That's where the gap is. That's unfortunately where it falls through.
Yes.
You get home, other things consume your mind, you get preoccupied with something else, and we're not using our votes, and we're not using our voices, and we're not putting it to the people who are in charge. That's what's scary to me and frustrating.
Because the Indigenous communities that were impacted and that are still impacted by this genocide, they don't get to move on. They don't get to forget about it. They don't get to go home and then cook dinner and forget to write that letter to the MP.
But are the rest of the people in Canada, us included, putting enough energy into putting?
No.
And so I don't know how to translate the emotion you feel with the shoes and the museums into that.
Yes.
I don't know.
Write your MP.
Yeah, write your MP.
Write your MP.
Write your MP.
Start something.
Put pressure on the government, and that starts local, and then it works its way up.
We could talk about this all day, and we will continue to talk about it on the show. In the meantime, Ivory, as always, thanks for being here. You were great.
My pleasure.
So wonderful. So wonderful.
Thank you.
Hey there, wasn't that great? Do you know where you can find some equally good content? Our YouTube page. It's filled with discussions, debates, and some laughs. Head there now, like and subscribe.